everyone. This will be a demo debate on the topic resolved. The benefits of school uniforms outweigh the harm. Speaking on the affirmative side, speaking first will be Arnab Sarkar and Serena Mao. Speaking second on the negative side will be Dylan Beach and Conrad Pallor. All right, will the affirmative team please take it away?
Okay. We affirm. Contention 1 is closing the school to prison pipeline. Dress codes are a necessary response to gang and gun violence in schools. Wilson 98 of BYU Law reports that the public school campuses of our nation are experiencing an unprecedented crisis of violence. Gang-related violence and crimes in public schools continue to grow and challenge school administrators and students. Student attendance and dropout rates are alarming, as are the presence of drugs, weapons, and violence. This proliferation of violence in our schools has created a sense of emergency for school districts. As a reaction to the threat of violence, many school boards are currently enforcing mandatory dress codes. These codes prohibit students from wearing clothes that is identifiable as gang clothing. And this has helped prevent gang members from recruiting in schools. The NCPC 14 confirms that gangs typically recruit their members while they are in primary or secondary school, leading these recruits towards academic malice, criminal activity, and incarceration. To reduce gang members' ability to reduce in schools and keep communities safer is to create and enforce a school uniform. Schools see a decrease in gang prevalence and school violence when they implement and enforce a school uniform compared to schools that do not have a school uniform. School uniforms improved academic success and graduation rates, increased attendance, and decreased suspensions, making uniforms a way to help students avoid gangs throughout their entire time in school and beyond. The impact is closing the school to prison pipeline. Nevada Today 13 quantifies that during the first year of implementing a uniform policy, school police data showed a 63% reduction in police log reports. Other decreases were noted in reports of gang-related activities and student fights, along with graffiti, property damage, battery, and administrative assists. Without a uniform policy, schools fuel the school to prison pipeline and trap students in cycles of poverty while disproportionately targeting minorities. Garcia 16 for the Witter Journal of Child and Family Advocacy reports that school-based policing is the fastest growing area in law enforcement. Public schools contribute directly to the school to prison pipeline by exposing students to the juvenile justice system for school-related offenses. School-related contributors create disengagement in learning and increase students' court involvement, making them more likely to drop out of school. Empirical evidence shows that discipline policies have the harshest impact on students of color. Contention 2 is elitism. Uniforms promote higher self-esteem and solidarity by eliminating classism in schools. Students' Rights 05 reports that student dress policies benefit students, keeping them safe, as students have better self-esteem because without name brand clothing on display, the students are placed on an equal level. Poor students do not feel and are not treated as inferior because they don't have nice clothes. And uniforms encourage a sense of belonging because they promote a feeling of community. Furthermore, uniforms create an even socioeconomic level in the school. Guru confirms that a child's wealth translates into what clothes and items he or she can afford, and this unbalance in the wealth of kids in a public school creates a bad environment for certain kids. The uniforms were a great way to level a diverse socioeconomic playing field. The impact is reducing bullying. School uniforms reduce bullying related to clothing, as Sandusky 14 confirms that roughly 160,000 children miss school daily due to fear of attack or intimidation by other students. But because everyone would be dressed the same, students would not be bullied because of their clothing. Uniforms also promote safety because if an intruder walked into school, it would be easier to spot them. Furthermore, school uniforms make it harder for bullies to identify students, as the BTRU 17 quantifies that 9 out of 10 teachers believe that school uniforms play an active role in reducing bullying, and 95% say that uniforms help students fit in. This is why overall dress codes are key to mitigate school violence. Wilder and Keogh 7 conclude that public schools have a responsibility to have safe and orderly schools that maintain an environment conducive to learning. This is one of the reasons that school districts implement dress codes. Educators report a decrease in violence, a reduction in fights in school, and improved student achievement when dress codes have been implemented. After a uniform policy begun in 2000, overall crime was down 14.7%, and there was an improved sense of belonging and tolerance. Thus affirm.
My partner and I negate the resolution, resolved the benefits of school uniforms outweigh the harms. Our first point of contention concerns self-expression. Clothing is one of the primary ways in which students express themselves and their personalities. Chris Rhodes explains in 2013 that allowing students to wear what they want is a core tenet in freedom of expression. Unfortunately, School uniforms directly inhibit this fundamental right of clothing as clothing as individuals are no longer able to express themselves and their personalities. Rhodes continues, mandating kids to wear the same clothing to school is a clear threat to individual liberties. Just like mandating all kids to have the same haircut, the same backpack, or the same lunchbox seems absurd, it is the path we go on once we start dictating what students can and cannot wear. The impact is a better society. Freedom of expression is one of the most important values a society can hold. Media Defense explains in 2018 that society hinges on people's ability to hold their own opinions and express themselves, both in terms of what they wear and in their daily lives. Without freedom of expression, individuals can't express themselves, their values, or their desires. Media Defense furthers that freedom of expression is a gateway issue in societies that aid in the protection of all rights. The right to freedom of expression allows individuals to shed light on important societal issues such as torture, LGBT persecution, and more. Our second argument concerns cost. One of the primary downsides of school uniforms is the tremendous cost it imposes on poor families. A report by Cost Helper found in 2015 that the average cost of school uniforms is between $100 to $600 per family. This places an unreasonable burden on poor families who also must buy clothing for their student to wear on the weekend or during the summer. Ferguson of The Guardian continues in 2019 that recently the cost of school uniforms has decreased 90%, forcing families to make a decision of whether they will buy clothing for their child or put food on the table. There are two impacts. First is diminished educational outcomes. Silver of The Independent finds in 2019 that 95% of parents think the cost of school uniforms are unreasonable. In fact, over 800,000 students go to school each year in poorly fitting uniforms because their parents can't afford to buy new clothing, with an additional 400,000 being sent home for wearing incorrect clothes. Cohen of the LA Times furthers that inadequate clothing can be one part of a sad equation that leads students to skip school and have behavioral and academic problems. For example, 13-year-old Alvaro Perez shivers in class on cold days because his parents aren't able to afford the long-sleeve school uniform and he is prohibited from wearing anything else. The second impact is poverty. Ferguson writes in 2019 that school uniforms face an unnecessary amount of pressure on poor families. Vulnerable families are forced to choose between getting a particular item of school uniform or necessities such as fuel or water. These unnecessary purchases are a contributor to childhood and family poverty. This is especially pertinent now, as many families are still recovering from the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Going to school, we argue, should still be a means for children to escape poverty, not a means of perpetuating it. For these reasons and more, my partner and I strongly urge a vote for the negative.
Do you mind if I start off?
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to start on your argument on self-expression. So you make this argument that people, when they don't have to wear school uniforms, they can express, themselves in ways that they want. And then you make this claim at the end of the contention that we head down a path where we restrict other rights. Can you name an example of a district or school in which uniforms were implemented and then other things followed?
So a couple of things. One, there's a lot of, so what our evidence would argue is that there's a lot of instances once a school district imposes a uniform requirement, they also start restricting other things. But then second, what we would argue is that we haven't seen the widespread impacts of this occur yet because we haven't seen a widespread expansion of school uniforms. Our evidence argues that if we did, we would see massive infringements upon civil rights and civil liberties. Can I have a question?
Sure.
Okay, so on your first argument about the school to prison pipeline, you tell me that there's like a 63% reduction in police, or in just crime in general in schools after school uniforms are imposed. How do we know that it was purely school uniforms that caused this change?
Well, one, the impact is a 63% reduction in police logs, so the police that run the schools. But the reason why is because the decrease in police logs precedes implementation of a school uniform. So in isolation, if one big policy like making every student wear the same thing results in a reduction in police logs, the correlation is pretty strong. Could I get another question?
Well, hold on one moment. So if that's true, why does that evidence indicate that there's a plethora of things that cause this change, such as a change in disciplinary practices at the school level?
The evidence says, quote, that during
Yeah.
the first year of implementing a school uniform policy, school police data showed a 63% reduction in police logs. Where does it say that there were other things that happened?
So yeah, in a subsequent interview, your author indicates that school uniforms aren't a silver bullet.
We're not saying that they're a silver bullet. We say that they reduce police logs. They're not 100% reduction. I'm sure there was more of a reduction later, which is probably what the author is alluding to. But this 63% reduction in police logs was due to the uniform policy. Could I take a question?
Yeah, certainly.
Sure. So I want to go back to this argument about self-expression. So you just said that most of the schools don't see an impact because we haven't had a widespread impact. But even if we haven't seen a widespread impact, your argument is that there is a slippery slope in these districts where it happens. I'm asking for an example of a district, because if your argument is true, you shouldn't need the majority of schools to have implemented a school policy. You should have seen it in the schools that did implement a uniform policy. So can you name one or two examples?
So we would argue that's not true, because in order for the slippery slope to occur, you obviously need a widespread rollout. But for instance, for instance, in Texas private schools, once they initiated a school uniform policy, they also started having more strict disciplinary guidelines, which we would say ultimately
Which evidence
decreased
substantiates this Texas example?
I'm sure I can find some.
Okay. Sure.
Okay. I think I'm good for rebuttal. So we'll start in a second. Student safety is the most important issue in the round, starting on their first argument about self-expression. Student safety is clearly more important for two reasons. First, on a short circuit, safety is always the most immediate concern and the prerequisite to anything else. If I'm worried about my safety or being bullied in school, I'm not going to complain that I can't wear anything I want to, because people need safe spaces to express themselves. But second is on the long term. The school to prison pipeline or bullying harm education now that's critical to finding jobs and developing future skills. On the other hand, this limited expression is only true during school hours and during school years, a very small percentage of their total time. This is also a prerequisite because if people can't find jobs later in life, they're not worried about being unable to freely express themselves. But on to the argument specifically. First, they say that students will wear whatever they want, but actually students often feel like they need to fit in instead. So instead of clothing being a creative outlet, it can be a source of a lot of pressure as students attempt to find what is appropriate or trending to wear. So instead of actually expressing themselves, they just wear what they think impresses others or won't get them bullied. But second, you can turn it because it's distracting to their studies. K2 Sweet 20 explains, if all students in a classroom are dressed the same, they're less likely to worry about their appearance and more likely to actually focus on school and develop those long-term life skills that are actually going to be important in the long term. Finally, back to this slippery slope argument about a bunch of other rights. Remember what Arno tells you in Cross, that Ingram 21 finds that half of public schools have uniforms. So not only is the change already widespread, but even after this widespread change and increase in uniforms, you've seen no limiting in the actual other freedoms that they say is going to basically create a spillover effect into. For example, you actually see more pro-rights activists right now, for example, in the LGBTQ community. So obviously there's really no clear correlation between uniforms and overall freedoms. But then second, remember what he tells you in Cross is that there's also no specific example of a school or a bunch of schools implemented a uniform policy and then also had other restrictions of freedoms. There's no actual evidence substantiating this. Let's go to their safety argument. Let's go to their cost argument. Student safety from our case also outweighs this cost argument because it links in. If students join gangs or are bullied, they lose a quality education and are more likely to engage in violence, both of which increase the chance of poverty in the long term. That's a better link in on A, magnitude, because having a bad job or no job loses you way more money versus just maybe $150 a year now. But B, on time frame, you only pay for school uniforms while you're in school, but your long-term job prospects affect you forever. Let's go respond to the argument specifically. First, Ingraham 21 explains a recent survey that is on the national level finds the average cost of uniforms is $150 per year, but furthest above their range evidence that's from $100 to $600 that's not an average. However, back to school clothing absent uniforms is $235, meaning that uniforms save $80 per child. They're not giving you the comparative. Even if uniforms are expensive, non-uniform clothing is even more expensive, which is why 86% of parents find that comparatively, they prefer school uniforms because it saves money. There's two reasons for this. A, because students may want to wear high-end brands if there's no uniforms, but uniforms are often just plain colored shirts that are pretty cheap. But B, fashion trends come and go. So without uniforms, students will buy clothes constantly, but with uniforms, it's the same piece of clothing every year. Second, they say that many students wear poorly fitting clothing. But if students are poor, if there are no uniforms, they're probably also wearing poorly fitting clothing. So it's kind of the same thing. Finally, they might say that this stuff is going to cause bullying because they mentioned some behavioral issues. However, even if uniforms don't exist, poor students are still going to wear both old and bad fitting clothes. If anything, having no uniforms exacerbates this bullying because uniform makes it a difference between good and bad versions of the same uniform, which is far less contrast than the difference between like a Gucci shirt compared to like a thrifted t-shirt. That's why BTRU from Case finds 95% of teachers say that overall uniforms help students fit in, which is why you trust the comparative statistics, because as Wilder finds, crime goes down 14.7% in schools with uniforms, and thus we affirm.
So just as a brief off-time roadmap, I'm going to be starting on the negative case and then moving over to the affirmative case. Start with my opponent's overview, where they say that student safety is a prerequisite to our arguments about freedom of expression. Their reasoning is that if students are worried about their safety, they're not focusing on their education. So I say, let's ask the students themselves, do you feel more safe when you have a school uniform policy? And their own study that they indicate, where 65% reduction in crime in a school that implemented school uniform policy, in a survey of those students found that 90% of those students did not like school uniforms, and they did not perceive that it actually increased safety. So there's no sort of educational effect. The next trend that they try to read is essentially saying is that they have long-term life skills as a result of educational policies. However, any argument that they make about academic achievement is not bared out in empirical literature. In fact, a study published by the University of North Carolina, when you control for socioeconomic status differences between schools that adopt school uniforms and schools that do not, found that there was no academic performance difference between schools that do and do not adopt school uniform policies. On the second contention about cost, their first argument says that what matters more is the long-term effects. And we agree that long-term effects matter, but school uniforms are a primary driver of negative long-term effects. Their second argument basically says that school uniforms have fallen. However, our Ferguson 2019 evidence indicates that there's a 90% increase in the cost, and their evidence is only looking at particular outfits. However, in total, our evidence indicates that school uniforms cost more than $450 per student. And even if you think that $150 is true, that's a lot of money for poor families. And then lastly, they say that it's going to save money in the long run because students won't buy high-end brands. A lot of low-income students aren't buying high-end brands in the first place. And they also say that there's less bullying because everybody's wearing the same thing. Well, if you're wearing the same thing, but you're wearing the exact same thing, you have one uniform for like a whole month, students that are lower income are still bullied because their clothing starts to smell because they have one outfit. Also, the comparison is in our realm that basically says is that when you have school uniforms, students still buy clothes for the weekends and summer, which is important because it's a unique cost increase. So our contention about cost still stands. Go to my opponent's arguments. Their first contention talks about gang violence. I'm going to have a couple of responses. My first response is that their argument is alternatively causal. Mark Oppenheimer finds in 2017 that studies that tout decreases in violence due to school uniforms do not control for necessary variables such as private versus public schools, changes in school culture, and more. Additionally, Oppenheimer finds that in the Reno school district that they identify, other anti-violence initiatives take place in addition to the efforts to reduce violence, which means you can't isolate the fact that it was just school uniforms. Their own author concludes that uniforms are not a silver bullet when it comes to fighting crime. My second response is you can turn the argument against my opponents. School uniforms make the problem of the school-to-prison pipeline worse. Smith explains in 2019 that one of the primary causes of the school-to-prison pipeline is punitive punishment for relatively minor offenses. This is crucial as Smith continues that school uniforms are one of the primary drivers of the school-to-prison pipeline as students are punished for not complying with school uniform policies. This turns their argument for two reasons. A, if you look at our second contention, students that are least likely to afford school uniforms are going to be punished for not being able to have well-fitting uniforms that comply with school policy. And B, for minority students, especially Black girls, cisgender, and transgender, they find that their bodies cannot fit into school uniforms. Their second contention talks about bullying. However, first of all, there is no difference. Students are more likely to be bullied if they're wearing like clothing that doesn't fit them. And secondly, 90% of students don't like it. And thirdly, a study indicated that crime rates increase 7% once school uniforms are implemented in a school district because there's more fighting over students that have uniforms that fit them and students that don't. They feel isolated. And for these reasons, I strongly urge vote for the negative.
Do you mind if I have the first question?
Yeah, no problem.
Sure. So you talk about how like the cost of uniforms has increased. What's the reason for this?
I think just increases in the costs of clothing more generally.
Yeah,
Also, the fact that the other reason is that a lot of schools, so like one of the things you mentioned is that like school uniforms are just like a polo shirt that's blue. There's an increasing trend amongst schools to have branded school uniforms. So instead of just like a blue polo shirt, it's like a blue polo shirt that says your high school name. And so that these uniforms are way more expensive than just like a normal blue polo shirt. And that's the trend nationally, is to have branded school uniforms.
Why is it the trend? Why isn't that true beforehand? Where did like schools get all this money from?
I mean, it's the students that are paying for it. I mean, this is our argument, right? That like schools basically try to have this. I mean, it's like your second contention is that it's this idea that maybe there's a sense of solidarity. And I don't know what the logic is, but essentially schools nationwide and around the world are adopting school uniforms that have like the school name on it. So students are literally forced to buy from one company that manufactures the school name, and they can't even buy cheaper options. And so that's why the cost of school uniforms are just increasing.
Yeah. So yeah, sure. You can take a question.
Okay. So one of your first responses when you try to give this weighing analysis is that what matters is the long-term job prospects of students. Is that just like the long-term educational outcomes matters more to students? Okay. So what evidence do you read that indicates that the long-term job prospects are actually increased as a result of school uniforms?
I don't remember the specific card name, but I believe it increases like school attendance, for example, and it increases academic performance. Yeah, I think we just have contrasting evidence that shows that like it kind of increases enrollment. Oh yeah, sure. So you talk about how like the crime, or yeah, you're more likely to have like bullying because like clothes don't fit you. So are you like more likely to be bullied if like, for example, like your sleeve is too long, or if you're wearing like a thrifted shirt and someone else is like wearing like Burberry or something? So
I think this debate is kind of missing the point, right? We think that bullying happens for a lot of reasons, right? Like you will get bullied maybe for having clothes that don't fit you right, but you might also get bullied for your haircut, things like that. Our argument is that we should just let the students decide for themselves. Bullying's always going to happen. Attempting to address like bullying with a Band-Aid fix that school uniforms all of a sudden going to make students like each other is just, I think, simply ridiculous. And I think when you have school uniform policies, you increase the amount of crime and increase the school to prison pipeline, because now students that are non-compliant with school uniform policies go to the principal's office, and that means that they're not learning, they're not benefiting.
Or like when you say like you should just let like the students decide, doesn't that just mean like we shouldn't do things to try to address bullying?
No, I think that we should do things to address bullying. My argument is just that attempting to think that what the student is wearing is the root cause of bullying is simply ridiculous. There's other reasons why students are bullying. So there's other issues that matter a lot more in schools. Like, is the school environment accessible? Can students afford to be there in the first place? And that's our argument.
Yeah, for sure.
The order is going to go our case, your second contention, our first contention, your second contention. Alrighty. Is everyone ready? Sounds good. Let's start on our case. We are going for our first contention about the school to prison pipeline. Our argument is very simple. School uniforms prevent students from wearing clothes that can be identified as gang clothing, which decreases the prevalence of gangs because gang clothing pressurizes students to join one or for protection, or generally makes them feel unsafe, which is why our NCPC evidence from 2014 does a national study from the NAESP in 2000 and finds that generally schools that have uniform policies and enforce those uniform policies see a decrease in gang prevalence. They make a couple of responses. The first thing they say is that there's alternate causes, and they indict our Nevada study. That's fine. We don't need our Nevada study. Our NCPC evidence is a national study and generally finds a broader trend that when uniforms are implemented, gang violence goes down. The second response they make is that there are punitive measures and punishments for students, but this evidence is in isolation and it is really, really old. Our wilder evidence is more specific and finds that generally when school uniforms are implemented, overall crime rates are down by 14.7%. But the second, then they read these two other reasons as to why their turn is preferable. But both of these are just reasons as to why the school to prison pipeline disproportionately impacts minorities, which happens in either world. You should vote for the team with the best link into the school to prison pipeline. And on a national, broader trend, which is what our evidence looks at, you should prefer our offense versus theirs. The last thing they say is that there is no correlation between the increase in a student uniform policy and a decrease in gang violence. But the problem is our evidence postdates theirs by 7 years. Their author is citing a 2007 study, and ours is from 2014. We just have much better evidence on this argument. Here is why you prefer the argument, because we say that when gang violence goes into areas, it fundamentally outweighs and takes out most of their arguments. This is because of the link in that Serena reads that Conrad does not respond to, which is that if students join gangs or are bullied, they lose quality education and are more likely to engage in violence, which is a better argument than theirs because of two reasons. A, on magnitude, because having a bad job, or in many cases no job, loses you much more money in the long term. So not only will you not be able to afford a school uniform, but generations of your family will not be able to afford a school uniform, or food, or water, or anything else that's essential. But second is on time frame. We say that you only pay for school uniforms while you're in school, but in the long term, there's a lot much more capital that you accumulate as an individual, which you lose out on. Let's go to their argument about cost, which is what they're going for. There are two fundamental arguments that lose them this round. The first one is the conceded non-unique. That is the third response that Serena makes. It says that with or without uniforms, these students who are poor will either wear hand-me-downs and misfit clothing, or they will not be able to keep up with the latest trends for expensive clothing. So either way, they will still be suffering from the same bullying, the same neglect, and the same ostracization from schools. But the second response that is really damning is the Ingram turn, which is a national study and much more preferable to their 90% cost evidence, which finds that 86% of parents find it more affordable to have school uniforms than no school uniforms. This evidence is more updated and is a better study overall than all of their front lines, which is why you should vote affirmative.
Let's go to our second contention about the cost of school uniforms. Conrad and I would argue two things that are going to win us the round. First, we would argue that the cost of school uniforms is prohibitively expensive, which causes students to go into poverty and multiple effects of poverty. Second, we would argue that because the cost is so prohibitive, students often get violations at school and disciplinary infractions imposed upon them that they would not have in the first place. The reason that's so important is because if they're being exposed to disciplinary practices and policing at the school level in instances when they wouldn't have, that's a much stronger link into the school to prison pipeline argument, which they talk about. Let's extend the argument. Remember the Ferguson evidence, which dictates that the cost of school uniforms is upwards of $450 per student. And we would say that's incredibly damning as it's increased by 90% annually, hurting poor students disproportionately. That leads us to both of our impacts. First, we say that it decreases educational outcomes because students are less willing to go to school in the first place in instances when they feel unsafe and which they feel like, and also they have less resources to go to school in the first place. Second, we say this increases poverty because students have less resources for things such as food and transportation, so they're not able to afford both going to school and life after school. They read some weighing about the school to prison pipeline, but we would say that we're the stronger link in. We'll get to that when they go to their, or when I go to their case. Then they say that ostracization occurs when students have to wear things like hand-me-downs, but we would say the comparative errors are con for two reasons. First, we would say even if this argument is true, the alternative is that they're experiencing crime and things of the sort, so and experiencing discipline. So we would say it's comparatively better. But then second of all, we would say that even if this is true, it's much more preferable for students to be able to have resources to go to school in the first place and have access to things such as food, fuel, and transportation. Then the final thing that they read is that 88% of parents think it's effective or affordable. There's a couple of issues. One, even if some parents think that the cost of uniforms is affordable, we would say that the Ferguson evidence accounts for this, postdates it, and indicates that now uniforms are far more expensive. Then let's go to their case. They extend this evidence that indicates there's a decrease in gang prevalence and activity. The issue with this is that at no point in Aronof's summary does he explain why this increases the school to prison pipeline. Which I do very eloquently in my summary is I tell you that the school to prison pipeline is directly impacted by students who wouldn't have been exposed to crime in the first place, being exposed to and wouldn't have been subject to disciplinary practices, being subjected to them now. That's why the term that Conrad reads wins us the round. Because if there is an increase in disciplinary practices that students are exposed to, there's obviously going to be an increase in the amount of time that students are exposed to the school to prison pipeline. Also, all of their evidence is alternatively causal. This is completely conceded because Conrad tells you that none of their evidence, or all their evidence, is prone to selection bias because it doesn't account for the income disparities between students who do and don't go to school with school uniforms.
All right, Grand Crossfire, would you all like the first question?
Sure. Let's start on the last thing you said, which is that like all of our evidence is alternatively causal. So when Conrad read this, he said that the Nevada evidence was alternatively causal. And we responded with the NCPC evidence, which is a national study that you don't indict. So why do you think that all of our evidence is alternatively causal?
Yeah, I'm glad you bring this up,
Sure.
Arnav, because so the evidence that you bring up in the last speech, this national study, essentially just says is that there is a correlation in which schools that have school uniform policies have 7% decrease in crime. The Oppenheim study not only indicts the Nevada study, but it also finds that generally studies that are on this topic fail because they don't account for the income disparities between schools, i.e. that there are more private schools that have school uniform policies than there are public schools. Private schools are naturally have less gang violence, and that's not because of school uniforms, but it's because of the fact that they're like private schools in richer areas and they're less like predisposed to crime.
I still don't see why that indicts. I still don't see why that indicts every study, especially if we give warrants, which I did extend, which is that, you know, there's less prevalence of gang clothing. Students are not pressurized to join these for protection, whereas they can, you know, just feel safe at school. So, I mean, again, like your evidence just says that we miss on warrants, but if we extend warrants in our speeches, I don't really see why it shows alternative causality when our warrants are pretty well, you know, articulated by our authors.
So,
and those are warrants that you say we are missing.
So the warrants that we extend accounts for this, right? Because we say even if they're more prone to, or like say with the indicts that Conrad reads accounts for all, indicates that all of these trends like can't be found after you.
Yeah, and if you want like alternative, and I think the problem, I guess, is that we should just prioritize like holistic studies in the round that control for things like causation, because even controlling for the fact that sure students are in school uniforms, our evidence indicates the fact that like gangs just turn to other means of recruitment. Like they'll turn to like the type of backpack the students wear, right? So there's like other factors that result in gang violence. It's like
your author says that. Your author says
it literally talks about how like backpacks and other things like that become the new recruitment.
But no, your author says that there are alternative things that cause for crime to go down, but that's not the same as what you just told me. You just said that your author says there are other reasons that gang violence goes up. So like, which one is it? Because then one of them takes out your alternate causality argument, right? If the alternate causality is reversed, then it doesn't apply to our argument.
I guess I'm confused about the last part.
It's fine. You can take a question. We've been on this for like all of cross.
Okay. So let's talk about the school to prison pipeline. So correct me if I'm wrong for the audience maybe listening. The school to prison pipeline just refers to the fact that students, particularly students of color, are put into the criminal justice system, right? Yep. What evidence do you read that indicates that gang violence is the root cause of the school to prison pipeline?
We never claim root cause, but our NCPC evidence says, quote, gangs recruit members while they're in primary and secondary school, leading these recruits towards incarceration.
If schools lead to prison down the line, why is that? Like, if a student is in a gang, right, and they're committing violent offenses, why is that the cause of the school to prison pipeline as opposed to punitive punishment for other crimes?
Because they join the gang from recruitment in schooles. That's what our affirmative does. It prevents recruitment in schools.
It's that students get
but it's what
system for crimes that they really didn't commit.
Conrad, I mean, you get recruited from a gang in school, you go to jail. That's our argument. Like, we just prevent you from joining the gang. And that's what our evidence says. There's a 14% reduction in crime. It's like,
The
it's almost
question
4
was,
minutes.
like,
So
why is gang activity the root cause of the school to prison pipeline?
we never claim that it is. We claim that it causes incarceration, which it links into all of our weighing. You don't have to use that specific word if you don't like it. Serena, do you want to call?
Yeah,
Yeah,
if you have
50
some
seconds.
console.
Cool.
Okay, so it's gonna be starting on our case and then weighing and then going to the next case. We're winning for our first contention on the school to prison pipeline because uniforms prevent students from wearing clothing that can be identified as gang clothing. That's really good because gang clothing places pressure on students to join gangs for protection, or they just generally feel unsafe. That's why the NCPC evidence finds that on the national level, there's a broader trend of a decrease in violence after uniform policies are adopted, with Wilder 07 quantifying that there's a 14.7% drop in crime after this policy. This is super important because Garcia concludes that gangs feed into the school to prison pipeline, decreasing engagement, hurting education, increasing the chance of a violent future, and poverty. They just first say that they can invalidate all our studies because of this one study saying that, oh, there's a bunch of studies that are bad, but that doesn't respond to the specific study. The NCPC study concludes that school uniforms are an effective policy at decreasing crime. So even if they indict all other general studies, they're not responding to this specific study. But then second, they clean drop our warrants. And insofar as the warrants are conceded, the reason for like uniforms decreasing gangs and decreasing the pipeline is going to still stand. That means that we're still getting some link into the impact. Then we can go onto their turn about this punitive thing about how they link in better to the pipeline. First, this is isolation. It's not the net effect of uniforms on the school to prison pipeline. Even if their turn is a contributor to the incarceration levels, gangs are far worse contributors because the NCPC and Wilder evidence find that overall, uniforms as a whole decrease violence, meaning that it takes into account the causes, like any factor that might increase violence because of uniforms. But second, our evidence is far more clear. We say there's a 14.7% decrease, which is a actual quantified number versus their like increase in like punitive things, which is like completely unquantified and unclear. But let's go to their case really quickly. On this cost argument, they just keep saying there's a 90% increase in cost and like this is like new evidence, but they don't respond to what my partner says, which is that our evidence is from 2021 saying that you save $80 when you have uniforms. That means that even if the cost of uniforms are increasing, comparatively having no uniforms is far more expensive. But they also really mishandle the 86% statistic who finds that parents agree that school uniforms are far more affordable than no school uniforms, meaning that even if the cost of uniforms are increasing, the cost of non-uniforms are increasing so much that it's still more affordable. Thus, we affirm.
The most important argument in the round is our argument about cost. My opponents have fundamentally not responded to the Ferguson evidence, which indicates that the average cost of an entire school uniform warehouse is $450. Serena comes up here in the last week that says that parents save $80 while buying school uniforms. However, they're not responding to our comparative, is that this is $80 plus all the other clothes that they buy for students that wear during the summertime and on the weekends. So they have to buy not only those clothing, but also the clothing to go to school, which is why school uniforms are a unique driver of poverty and incarceration. They say that the school to prison pipeline is the most important argument, and we would agree. You should prioritize our evidence on this question that indicates that the reason as to why the school to prison pipeline exists is not because of violent crime in school that causes students to get locked up. Rather, our evidence from Smith indicates that it's due to relatively minor concerns in which students of color and poorer students are put into the criminal justice system, even though they're not criminal. And this is an important comparative, is that they're only affecting students that commit violent crimes, but we're talking about students that are just poor who have poor fitting school uniforms. And the comparative is that even if students are wearing poor fitting clothing in either world, in a world in which you have school uniforms, those students are being punished for wearing school uniforms, which means that for students who are poor, who can't afford school uniforms, they're more likely to go into the criminal justice system. And for minority students, such as people that wear headscarves for religious traditions or transgender individuals who have different shaping bodies, they're more likely to get put into the criminal justice system, which means we're directly controlling a link into the lifelong effects of the school to prison pipeline. On their case, they read one study that gang violence decreases. Two problems. First, gang violence doesn't matter because it's not the root cause of the school to prison pipeline. Violent crime is not. It's nonviolent offenses and kids getting put into the criminal justice system. Second, our study answers their NCPP evidence that indicates that there's a difference between schools that adopt school uniforms and schools that do not adopt school uniforms, such as the fact that they're private schools versus public schools in richer areas. So when you control for income, you find that there's no crime difference between schools that have school uniforms or schools that do not have school uniforms. And for these reasons, I strongly urge a vote for the negative.